"I want nothing to do with you or that child," my dad said when I told him I was pregnant at 17. 10 years later, I sat in the courtroom, ready to pass judgment on a fraud case, and he walked in as the accused. He went pale and whispered, "Judge, that's my daughter." The Texas sun beat down hard that afternoon, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement of Willow Creek's modest streets. 17-year-old Savannah Miller sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers tightening around a folded slip of paper. It was a test result she had read 5 times already, but still she stared at the word printed in faint blue ink, like it might somehow change. Positive. She closed her eyes, trying to drown out the distant hum of cicadas and the faint knock of the ceiling fan above. The room she shared with her mother was small and sun-faded, filled with second-hand furniture, and shelves lined with old school trophies and faded photographs. It had always felt safe, until today. She thought first of her mother, who was working a double shift at the diner. There was no doubt in her mind that her mother would support her. But Savannah knew this wasn't something her mother could fix. This was hers. Hers to carry. Hers to decide. And then there was the other name that tugged at her mind, a name she had hardly spoken in the last 6 years. Douglas Miller, her father. Once a Sunday visitor with candy in his pockets and promises in his voice. Then suddenly, nothing. Just silence and absence. Her decision was made before she had time to talk herself out of it. She grabbed her phone, fingers trembling, and called the number she had stored under a name she hadn't dared touch in years. Dad. To her surprise, he answered after 2 rings. "Savannah?" His voice sounded older, rougher. "Hi," she said, swallowing the lump in her throat. I need to talk to you. It's important." There was a pause, long and hollow. "All right. Come by my office. You still know where it is?" She did. A narrow strip mall on the outskirts of town. He ran a small accounting firm there, though she had never visited since he stopped showing up to birthdays and holidays. She borrowed her mother's car, lying about needing to pick up school supplies. The drive was short but felt like a journey back into someone else's life. When she arrived, Douglas was sitting behind a cluttered desk, stacks of paper hiding his hands. He looked up, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe guilt, but it vanished quickly. "You've grown," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Savannah didn't sit. She stood, arms crossed, gripping the folded test result in her palm. "I'm pregnant." The words dropped like a stone. She half expected him to shout, to demand answers, but instead he leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said after a long silence. "That's all you have to say," her voice cracked. "I thought maybe you'd want to know, that maybe you'd care." He looked down at his desk. "Savannah, I'm not in a position to be involved in something like this. I've got responsibilities, a new life, a family that—" "I'm your family," she interrupted, voice rising. "I'm your daughter." He stood up then, suddenly towering, his tone shifting into something cold and final. "You chose to come here. You wanted honesty. So here it is. I want nothing to do with you or that child." The room spun. For a moment, all Savannah could hear was the roar of blood in her ears. "I just thought, maybe you'd want to be part of his life," she whispered, tears stinging. But Douglas had already turned his back, walking toward the door. "Goodbye, Savannah. Please don't come here again." She didn't remember leaving or how she made it back to the car. Only that when she got home, she sat in the driveway for what felt like hours, staring out the windshield, the last pieces of a childhood fantasy dissolving into the humid air. That night, she told her mother everything. And as expected, her mother didn't yell or cry. She just wrapped her arms around Savannah and said, "We'll get through this, one step at a time." In the quiet darkness of her room, Savannah stared up at the ceiling fan, its slow rotation like the hands of a clock refusing to stop. Her world had changed forever, but for the first time in her life, the fear didn't paralyze her. It pushed her. She was going to have this baby, and she was going to build a life for him, no matter who walked away. She reached for her notebook and wrote 3 words across the first page in bold letters. For Noah. Always. The days that followed were a quiet storm. Savannah returned to school carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing hour. In the hallways of Willow Creek High, whispers lived in corners and behind lockers, but none of them knew the truth. Not yet. She walked with her head high, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear, planning, and late-night tears muffled into pillows so her mother would not hear. She had no idea what came next. All she knew was that she couldn't face it alone. It was on a cloudy Thursday morning, after throwing up in the girls' bathroom between first and second period, that she found herself knocking on the door of the school counselor's office. Mrs. Rowan was a tall, no-nonsense woman with a warm voice and an uncanny ability to read faces before words were spoken. Savannah didn't have to explain much. One look, and Mrs. Rowan offered her a tissue, closing the door gently behind them. For the next hour, Savannah let the truth spill out, the rejection, the fear, the loneliness, and the tiny heartbeat growing inside her. She expected judgment or pity. What she got instead was a calm nod and a question. What do you need? It was the first time anyone had asked her that. I need to finish school, Savannah whispered. I need to make sure he has a future. Mrs. Rowan became her compass from that day forward. She helped her coordinate doctor visits around her class schedule, connected her with support groups for teen mothers, and made arrangements with teachers so she could keep up with her assignments. At a time when everything felt fragile, that small office became a place of strength. But no one understood her better than Claire. Claire had been Savannah's best friend since second grade, back when scraped knees and sidewalk chalk were the most pressing matters of the day. When Savannah finally broke the news to her, standing under the bleachers during lunch, Claire's reaction was immediate and fierce. "You're not doing this alone," she said, gripping her hand. "We've faced every disaster together, and this one's no different." Claire became her shield, walking with her when the whispers started, standing by her in the cafeteria when eyes turned curious or cruel. When students muttered behind cupped hands or made offhand jokes, Claire stared them down. And when Savannah cried silently during math class, Claire slid her notes across the desk with a quiet, "I got you." Savannah leaned on them both, on Mrs. Rowan's structure and Claire's unwavering loyalty. She learned how to navigate her changing body and an equally unpredictable emotional landscape. There were days when her feet ached from standing too long and nights when sleep refused to come. But in between, there were moments of stillness, the sound of a heartbeat during a sonogram, the gentle flutter of movement beneath her skin. A new kind of wonder began to grow. She kept a journal, writing letters to the baby she had started calling Noah in private. They were half lullabies, half promises. She told him about the world, about the stars outside her window, about how much she wished he could meet her mother's father, who had taught her how to fish and believed in second chances. "Maybe you'll have his eyes," she wrote one night, "or maybe his calm. Either way, you're already more loved than you know." Savannah began working part-time at a local bookstore after school and on weekends. The owner, a kind woman named Doris, didn't ask questions when she noticed the slight swell beneath Savannah's apron. Instead, she offered flexible hours and slipped her home-cooked meals when she looked too tired to stand. Books became her escape. In the quiet minutes before closing, she'd find herself lost in pages about faraway places, courtrooms, adventures, and women who had survived worse and come out stronger. One evening, while shelving returned books, she came across a worn paperback titled The Measure of Justice. Its story followed a young woman who became a lawyer against all odds, and Savannah read it in one sitting after Noah kicked for the first time. It lit a flame she didn't know had been waiting. That night, she sat with her mother at the kitchen table, a cold glass of milk between them, and said, "I think I want to study law. I want to help people, especially the ones who don't have anyone to fight for them." Her mother, tired from another shift, smiled and reached across the table to take her hand. "Then you will. You already know how to fight." As fall faded into winter, Savannah began to see herself not just as a girl trying to survive a mistake, but as someone becoming something more. The people around her didn't see her pregnancy as the end of the road. They treated it like a detour. One she could navigate, one she could emerge from stronger. She volunteered for extra credit projects, started tutoring other students, and spoke in a school assembly about resilience at Mrs. Rowan's urging. She stood in front of a crowd of classmates and faculty, her voice shaking but steady, and said, "I used to think being pregnant at 17 meant I had failed, but I've learned it just means I'm taking a different path, one that still leads forward." The applause was quiet at first, then growing. Not everyone approved, but something shifted that day. The whispers didn't disappear, but they softened, and Savannah walked out of the auditorium not as a warning, but as proof. She was going to do this. With Claire beside her, with Mrs. Rowan's guidance, with her mother's quiet strength, and above all, with the growing life inside her, reminding her every day why she could not give up. The road ahead was long, but she no longer feared it. The early morning hours of June 14th arrived cloaked in thunder. Rain drummed steadily on the hospital window as Savannah clutched the bed rail, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Her mother stood at her side, holding her hand through each wave of contraction, while the nurse moved swiftly around the room. Savannah's breathing was sharp, her thoughts blurred between fear and longing, but she focused on one thing: meeting the baby whose heartbeat had been the soundtrack of her life for the past 9 months. After hours of labor, when dawn had just begun to break through the storm, Noah James Miller entered the world, red-faced and wailing. Savannah cried too, not from pain, but from the impossible weight of emotion crashing over her. As they placed him on her chest, his tiny fists curled instinctively against her skin, and something in her heart that had once felt cracked beyond repair suddenly began to knit itself together. She whispered his name over and over again like a prayer. Noah, Noah. In that moment, the rejection she'd endured, the sleepless nights, the fear of what lay ahead, all of it faded beneath the warmth of his breath against her neck. He was real. He was hers. They stayed at the hospital for 2 days. Claire came with flowers and a hand-sewn baby blanket she'd made with help from her grandmother. Mrs. Rowan visited with a stack of brochures about early childhood resources and a handwritten card filled with encouraging words. Doris from the bookstore sent a small basket of books for new mothers. Even her teachers signed a note that read, "Congratulations, Savannah. We're proud of you." Returning home with a newborn changed everything. The walls of their small duplex seemed narrower, the hours shorter, the silence between feedings louder. Savannah quickly learned that sleep came in fragments, and that motherhood, despite its beauty, was relentless. But each time she cradled Noah, every hardship seemed to shrink beneath the miracle of his presence. Her mother took leave from work for 2 weeks to help with the transition. Together, they rearranged the apartment, converting a corner of Savannah's bedroom into a nursery, with hand-me-down furniture and soft yellow curtains. They painted stars on the wall, Noah's name spelled out in wooden letters above the crib. The scent of baby lotion and fresh laundry became the new perfume of the household, but after her mother returned to work, Savannah was on her own during the day. Diapers, bottles, colic, and teething, each presented a new challenge. She kept a notebook on the kitchen counter where she wrote questions, appointments, feeding times, and goals. Some days she didn't get through half the list. Other days she added lines like, "Noah smiled today," or "He grabbed my finger and didn't let go." There was no instruction manual, but she began to understand her son's patterns, the way he calmed when she sang, the look in his eyes when he recognized her voice, the sleepy weight of his head against her shoulder. Savannah started to feel less like a girl improvising and more like a mother finding her rhythm. By fall, she returned to school part-time with a revised class schedule that allowed her to attend morning courses while her mother worked evening shifts. Claire watched Noah when she could, and Savannah's teachers adapted assignments so she could work from home when necessary. It was far from easy. Many days she arrived to class running on less than 3 hours of sleep, her notes incomplete, her hands smelling faintly of formula. But she never missed a day she didn't have to. Noah became the center of her world, but Savannah refused to let him become her only world. She studied between feedings, read textbooks aloud to him during the quiet afternoons, and completed homework while he napped on her chest. He became both her reason and her strength. The school counselor arranged for a social worker to connect Savannah with a local support program for young mothers. Once a week, she sat in a circle with girls her age, some younger, some older, each carrying different versions of the same story. They shared advice, frustrations, victories. Savannah listened more than she spoke, but in that room, she didn't feel alone. She saw reflections of herself in every tired but determined face. Outside the group, she kept her focus forward. She dreamed of college, of wearing a cap and gown with Noah in the crowd clapping his tiny hands. She dreamed of a job that could make a difference, a home where Noah could grow up proud of the life she'd built. That vision stayed with her, propelling her through hard days. Every milestone became a quiet triumph. Noah's first giggle, the first time he rolled over, his first steps months later, stumbling toward her outstretched arms. Each of these moments reminded her that she hadn't lost her future. She had reshaped it. Her bond with Claire grew even stronger. They made time for coffee shop conversations with Noah, snoozing in a stroller beside them. They laughed at the absurdity of balancing diapers and deadlines, at how much had changed in a year. Claire often reminded her, "You're doing the impossible, and somehow you're making it look like the plan all along." Savannah never believed she was extraordinary. She simply did what needed to be done. But the quiet truth she rarely spoke aloud was that she no longer feared the path she had chosen. Her life didn't look like the ones in her classmates' yearbooks, but it was real, full of grit and grace. She had traded simplicity for purpose, comfort for resilience, and in return she had gained something deeper than she had ever expected, a reason to fight harder, dream bigger, and love without limits. Noah's laughter became her favorite sound, his sleepy weight in her arms, her favorite comfort. And when she looked in the mirror each morning, eyes tired but focused, she no longer saw a teenager who had made a mistake. She saw a mother building something lasting. A new life had begun, not just for Noah, but for her as well. The first semester after Noah's birth had felt like climbing a mountain in the dark. Each step required more energy than Savannah believed she had. Still, she pressed on. And when her final grades arrived, she stared in disbelief at the glowing marks across the screen. Her teacher's comments praised not only her academic effort, but also her resilience. One line stood out, "There's strength in your focus. Keep going." Savannah printed it and taped it above her desk, right next to Noah's first drawing, which was more a swirl of crayon than anything else, but precious nonetheless. Her days were divided with clinical precision. Mornings began before sunrise with feedings and diaper changes. Then came school, study blocks, part-time shifts at the bookstore, dinner preparation, laundry, baths, bedtime stories. By the time the house grew quiet and she could sit down, her body ached with fatigue, but her mind stayed restless. That was when the dreams crept back in. Ambitions she had tucked away in the months after Noah's birth, now returning not as fantasies but as quiet, persistent truths. She still remembered what it felt like to hold the measure of justice in her hands, to imagine herself not just surviving, but thriving, to picture a courtroom and see herself standing at the front, not as a defendant, not as a forgotten voice, but as a force of change. It sounded bold, perhaps impossible, but the dream remained. Savannah's senior year arrived sooner than expected. On the surface, she was like any other high school student preparing for graduation, but her reality was different. Most of her classmates talked about parties, prom, and freedom. Savannah thought about childcare arrangements and grant applications. While others picked colleges based on distance from home or campus life, Savannah chose schools that offered flexible class schedules and family housing. The local university in Austin became her top choice. It was less than an hour away, had a reputable pre-law program, and, most importantly, offered scholarships for single mothers and academic achievers. Claire helped her craft the application essay, which began not with grades or goals, but with the story of a rainy morning in a hospital room, holding a newborn and promising him a life built on purpose. The essay struck a chord. A few weeks later, Savannah received an email confirming her acceptance, accompanied by a scholarship that would cover tuition and supplies for her first year. She stared at the screen, Noah nestled against her chest, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She hadn't just returned to school. She was moving forward, truly forward. Her mother cried when she read the letter. "Your grandfather would be proud," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Savannah's face. They stood in the kitchen, both aware of the road ahead, neither pretending it would be easy, but both unwilling to let fear dictate the future. Claire announced her own plans to attend a college nearby, and the two began imagining what life might look like in Austin. Claire promised babysitting shifts and late-night study sessions. They planned furniture layouts and brainstormed part-time job options. For the first time, Savannah saw not just a path, but a future full of movement and hope. The transition to college came with new adjustments. The apartment they found near campus was small and weathered, with peeling paint and creaky floors, but to Savannah, it felt like the beginning of something monumental. She set up a play area for Noah beside her desk, organized shelves of textbooks next to stuffed animals, and filled the tiny kitchen with the scent of her mother's recipes. Classes pushed her mind in ways she hadn't expected. Law lectures demanded long hours of reading and writing. Professors assumed a level of freedom and time she didn't always have, but Savannah refused to ask for less. Instead, she pushed harder, studying after Noah's bedtime, listening to lecture recordings during laundry, memorizing case law while washing dishes. The juggling act was precarious, but it was hers. Her professors noticed her diligence. One of them, Dr. Carmichael, a sharp-eyed woman who had worked as a prosecutor for 2 decades, pulled Savannah aside after class one day. "You think like someone who's had to argue for herself," she said. "Have you considered applying for the court internship program?" Savannah hesitated. "I'm not sure they'd want someone like me." Dr. Carmichael raised an eyebrow. "Someone like you? You mean someone who's already learned how to fight and still shows up prepared? That's exactly who they want." With encouragement from both Dr. Carmichael and Claire, Savannah submitted her application. Weeks passed. Then the email arrived. She had been accepted into the fall internship cycle at the county courthouse. It was unpaid, but it offered first-hand exposure to legal proceedings, shadowing judges and reviewing case files. It was, as Claire said, the real thing. Savannah stepped into the courthouse on her first day with nerves dancing beneath her skin. Everything smelled of wood polish and old paper. She was assigned to Judge Valerie Brandt's chambers, a woman known for her keen intellect and no-nonsense demeanor. The first time they met, Judge Brandt simply said, "If you're here to learn, then listen more than you speak, and always be early." Savannah took those words to heart. She observed hearings, reviewed documents, organized schedules, and watched people make arguments that held the weight of real lives. She studied how justice was applied, how words became weapons or shields, how judges carried both responsibility and burden. It was as thrilling as it was sobering. At night, she returned to her apartment and to Noah, who was now walking and babbling non-stop. She would sit on the floor with him, legal pads scattered around them, and smile as he pointed to letters, repeating sounds, his curiosity blooming. She told him stories about the courtroom, not the grim parts, but the lessons, the people, the victories. "One day you'll understand," she'd whisper. "One day I'll show you where this all began." Her dreams had never disappeared. They had waited patiently beneath the surface, weathering fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. Now they no longer felt distant. They were rising. The first time Savannah stood behind the glass wall of a courtroom as part of her internship, something clicked into place. It wasn't grand or cinematic. There was no swelling music, no epiphany shouted into the air. It was quieter than that, a deep, grounded certainty in her chest as she observed the judge presiding, the attorneys speaking, the rhythm of the room shifting with every word spoken. She belonged here not as a visitor, not even as a student, but as someone who would one day take part in shaping what happened between those walls. Her mornings began at 5 o'clock. Her evenings ended near midnight. There was no balance, only momentum. But she was no longer pushing against the current, she was moving with it. Her internship under Judge Brandt was demanding, and Brandt herself was never generous with praise. But Savannah understood. Respect in that world was earned through precision and perseverance, not sentiment. She learned how to read not just documents, but people. The way defendants looked at the floor, how attorneys leaned forward when confident and back when unsure, how witnesses paused before lying. She watched the weight of decisions land on the judge's shoulders and imagined one day carrying it herself. Her mind, once filled with self-doubt, now moved with conviction. Noah was 3 years old when Savannah gave her first courtroom presentation as part of the internship. She had been asked to prepare a briefing summary of a recent civil case and present her findings before a panel of law students and interns. She stood before them in a borrowed blazer, hands trembling slightly, voice even and clear. Her analysis was sharp, her reasoning firm. When it ended, there was a brief silence before applause. Later, Judge Brandt said only, "Concise, accurate, you're paying attention." Savannah walked out of that building that afternoon into the soft warmth of spring, her chest rising with something close to pride. Not for the recognition, but for how far she had come from the girl who once sat in a cold office begging her father to care. Claire remained her anchor. Though their paths had diverged, Claire pursuing education, Savannah absorbed in law, they still met weekly, sometimes just for 30 minutes over coffee. Claire never tired of hearing about the cases, the people, the strategy. "You come alive when you talk about this," she'd say. "It's like watching someone step fully into their purpose." It was during one of those conversations that Savannah revealed her next step. "I want to take the LSAT next year," she said quietly, as if saying it too loudly might ruin the chance. "I want to apply to law school." Claire didn't blink. "Then let's map it out. You're doing it." That summer became a blur of preparation. Savannah juggled parenting, part-time work, and hours of LSAT study late into the night. She covered the walls of her apartment with flashcards, logic puzzles, test strategies. Noah watched her with fascination, often repeating words she mumbled to herself. "Logical reasoning," he'd say proudly, and she would laugh through tears, exhausted and amazed at the life they had built. Her scores improved with each practice test. The ambition that had once seemed too heavy to carry now felt like muscle memory. Savannah submitted her applications to 3 law schools, all within reach of Austin, and waited. During that waiting period, something unexpected happened. Judge Brandt, known for her distance and formality, called her into chambers and handed her a sealed envelope. "Recommendation letter," she said. "Strong one. You deserve it. Make it count." Savannah was too stunned to speak at first. Then she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you. For everything." Brandt offered a rare smile. "Just keep proving people wrong." The first acceptance came 2 months later. It was from the University of Austin Law School. Full admission, with a partial scholarship. Savannah sat on the floor with Noah in her lap, the letter shaking in her hands. He looked at her, puzzled by her silence. "Good news, Mama." "The best," she whispered, kissing his forehead. Law school tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The coursework was brutal, the competition fierce, the expectations higher than ever. But Savannah didn't falter. She had spent years learning to survive. Now, she wanted to lead. Her professors took notice, especially those who learned her story, how she had raised a child alone, worked jobs between classes, and still managed to outperform students with far fewer burdens. Her understanding of the law was not just theoretical, it was personal. Every statute she studied, every precedent she reviewed, she connected to people's lives. She had lived the consequences of abandonment, of economic strain, of being dismissed before speaking. She wanted to be the voice others didn't have. In her second year, she joined a legal aid clinic, representing clients who couldn't afford attorneys. She sat across from single mothers fighting for custody, tenants facing eviction, and teenagers one wrong decision away from losing their futures. Savannah didn't see strangers. She saw reflections of herself, of the girl who had once walked into a courthouse carrying more fear than hope. Each case sharpened her skills, but more importantly, it affirmed her purpose. She wasn't chasing power or prestige. She was building something. One ruling, one brief, one victory at a time. Noah, now old enough to understand more, would sit at the dinner table and ask, "Did you help someone today?" And every time Savannah answered yes, it reminded her why she could not afford to fail. 3 years after that first internship, Savannah graduated with honors, her son clapping in the audience. She passed the bar exam on her first try, her hands shaking only once, when she signed the confirmation letter. The spark that had ignited behind that courtroom glass had never gone out. It had grown slow and steady, into a flame she carried with her. She wasn't just fulfilling a dream, she was rewriting the legacy her father had tried to deny her, and she was only just getting started. The courthouse had become a second home to Savannah. The rhythm of hearings, the formalities of legal procedure, the quiet tension of anticipation, it all felt familiar now, like a language she had mastered through grit rather than privilege. By 26, she had already handled a series of pro bono cases that drew praise from senior attorneys and judges alike. Her name, once just a line on class rosters, had begun appearing in local legal articles and professional circles. Yet she kept her head low, her goals clear. Every victory mattered, but none defined her. Her measure of success was deeper than headlines. Noah, now 8 years old, had grown into a bright, observant child who often mimicked her mannerisms. He liked sitting at the table when she reviewed notes, asking simple but thoughtful questions about right and wrong. Savannah never spoke about her past in full. Not yet. But sometimes when she looked at him, she imagined what he would think if he knew the man who had refused them once still existed somewhere in the same state. She hadn't spoken his name in years. Douglas had become a shadow she no longer chased, a closed door she refused to revisit. She hadn't needed to. Her life had unfolded without him, her accomplishments born entirely from the community she had built and the effort she refused to compromise. She thought about him sometimes, brief flashes, especially on holidays, or when Noah asked why she didn't have a dad like some of his classmates. She always replied with honesty and warmth, "Families look different for everyone. What matters is who shows up." Her judicial appointment came faster than anyone expected. The news was announced in a modest press release, her name buried beneath a list of other rising legal professionals. She was appointed as an associate judge in her district, a historic achievement not just because of her age, but because of what she represented. A judge who understood hardship not as a theory, but as memory. One who had once stood outside the courthouse, unnoticed, and now carried the responsibility of passing judgment inside its walls. Savannah received quiet congratulations from colleagues, proud nods from mentors, and emotional support from friends who had watched her rise from part-time student to legal authority. Claire brought her flowers and joked about how surreal it felt to know a judge personally. Noah, beaming, asked if she could put a gavel in his backpack for show and tell. Her first weeks on the bench were careful and deliberate. She listened more than she spoke. She observed the weight of her words before delivering them. Every case she handled reminded her of the human lives that rested behind the legal jargon. She worked late into the night, often rereading files, questioning assumptions, reflecting on whether justice had truly been served. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when she noticed the name again. She had been reviewing the upcoming docket for the following week, scanning through routine matters. Her eyes moved quickly until they landed on a case scheduled for a fraud hearing. The defendant's name sat plainly on the page, Douglas R. Miller. She froze. Her hand stopped mid-motion over her pen. Her breathing stalled. It wasn't an uncommon name, she told herself. Texas was large. Coincidences happened, but still something twisted in her chest, sharp and immediate. She read the file again. Age, 57. Occupation, accountant, former business owner. Current residence, a small town less than 30 miles from where she had grown up. There was no doubt. It was him. The details of the case were clear. Douglas had been accused of falsifying documents, misrepresenting financial statements, and defrauding several clients in a series of complex schemes. The trial had been delayed multiple times due to procedural complications, but now it was firmly set to proceed. And as fate had arranged, Savannah was the presiding judge. She sat in silence for several minutes, the page before her suddenly heavy with history. Her fingers moved to close the file, but they lingered. Her mind filled with images she hadn't conjured in years. A sterile office, a cold rejection, the echo of his final words, "I want nothing to do with you or that child." Savannah stood slowly, moving to the window of her chambers. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, indifferent to the upheaval stirring in her thoughts. She had come so far from that day, so much had changed, and yet the presence of that name felt like a wound reopening, not bleeding, but fresh with memory. She could have recused herself, it would have been justified. But as she stood there, watching the traffic pass beneath the late afternoon sun, she understood something deeply personal and utterly unshakable. This was not a story of revenge. It was not even a story of confrontation. It was a test of her growth, of her values, of whether the woman she had become could face the man who tried to unmake her, and do so with grace, power, and neutrality. She would not step aside. She returned to her desk and placed the file neatly on the corner, her expression calm, her decision made. She would hear the case. She said nothing to anyone, not even Claire, not her mother, not Noah. The knowledge rested with her alone, heavy and silent, but not unbearable. She refused to let it change the course of her work. Every morning she walked into the courthouse the same way she had for years, head high, prepared, steady. Still, as the trial date approached, Savannah found herself remembering, not with pain, but with clarity, the years of silence, the milestones passed without acknowledgement, the nights she had rocked Noah to sleep while wondering if he would ever ask about the man who had once refused to say his name. The past was never truly gone, only waiting for its moment to return. And now that moment had arrived. The courthouse echoed with a sense of order Savannah had once only dreamed of commanding. Wearing the black robe for the first time had not made her feel powerful, it had made her feel responsible. The fabric felt heavier than it looked, as though it carried every decision, every plea, every fragile hope of those who stood before her. She understood that weight intimately because she had once stood on the other side of the bench, invisible and desperate for someone to listen. Now, every time she entered the courtroom, she did so with reverence. Her chambers were modest, tucked behind the courtroom with walls lined in soft mahogany. The desk, though large, felt like an old friend. Piles of case files, handwritten notes, and sticky tabs marked the space not as a place of authority, but as a workshop where justice was sculpted with care and caution. Her clerk, Ms. Talbot, kept things moving smoothly. Files arrived on time, the schedule remained firm, and Savannah had room to breathe, analyze, and reflect. But even in the best-managed systems, the emotional toll of judging never dulled. She had issued her first sentencing just 2 months earlier. A young man barely 21 charged with auto theft. He had pleaded guilty. His record was clean until that point, his story riddled with the desperation of an unemployed parent trying to provide for a younger sibling. Savannah listened carefully. The law gave her structure, but it didn't remove the human equation. She sentenced him to a diversionary program with community service and mandated counseling. It was legal, it was just. But more importantly, it gave him a future not marked permanently by a single mistake. Her reputation began to take shape, not for being lenient, not for being harsh, but for being precise. Attorneys remarked on her detailed opinions, how she referenced precedent while never ignoring the person beneath the legal label. Some found her approach unconventional, but none called it careless. She had become known for her calm demeanor, for listening fully before speaking, for making even the most seasoned lawyers reconsider how they presented their cases. Outside the courtroom, she was still Savannah Miller, mother to Noah, friend to Claire, daughter to a woman who had never let the world swallow them whole. But within those walls, she was Judge Miller, measured, fair, and quietly formidable. She kept her personal life entirely separate, not out of shame, but out of respect for the boundaries that kept her work clean. Her son knew what she did, but not the full scope of it. "Mama helps people make things right," he would say. And that definition was enough. Noah had grown into a thoughtful 10-year-old, full of questions, endlessly curious. He loved reading books with courtroom settings and asked if he could sit in on one of her cases someday. She told him maybe, one day. For now, he saw her work through quiet evenings filled with papers and the rare moments when she let him sit beside her at her desk while she reviewed files. Claire remained part of her world, now working as an educational advocate. They had grown together, their paths woven by years of shared struggle and victories. They met often, though time had made those moments rarer. Still, when they sat down for coffee, everything flowed as naturally as it had when they were teenagers dreaming of what came next. Then came the week when Douglas Miller's name returned to the docket. Savannah had not spoken it aloud. She had not told Claire, not even her mother. She had only nodded when Ms. Talbot confirmed the scheduling of the fraud trial. Savannah reviewed the documents late at night, sometimes more than once, memorizing the timeline, the transactions, the testimony of victims. She approached it like every other case, thoroughly, objectively, but beneath the surface, something sharp lay buried. She had not seen his face since the day he turned her away. Not in passing, not even by chance. She did not search for him online, never asked her mother if she had heard from him. His silence had been complete. Now his name existed not as a memory, but as part of an official case file. That fact alone demanded her neutrality. She told herself that again and again. Yet when she walked into the courtroom on the morning of the hearing, something inside her shifted. The courtroom was quiet as she entered. The bailiff called for order. Attorneys adjusted their papers. The air held its usual tension. Then the defendant was announced. Savannah sat up straighter. A moment later he walked in. Douglas. His hair was thinner, grayer. He looked older than she remembered, but not entirely different. The sharp lines of his face, the narrow set of his shoulders, the way he glanced around the room with faint detachment. It was all familiar. Then his eyes landed on her, and the detachment broke. He stopped mid-step. There was no mistaking the recognition. His lips parted slightly, color draining from his face. He stared, frozen, as though seeing a ghost. Then he whispered something the bailiff didn't catch, but Savannah read it from the shape of his mouth. "Judge, that's my daughter." She did not flinch, did not blink, did not allow any ripple to betray the storm that crashed quietly within her chest. Instead, she turned her gaze to the papers before her, confirmed the case number, and spoke the words she had rehearsed with every ounce of discipline she could summon. "This court is now in session." The moment passed. The day unfolded in motions and procedures. Witnesses were scheduled, documents submitted. Douglas said little. His attorney spoke on his behalf, requesting more time to prepare certain aspects of the defense. Savannah listened, responded, and ruled with the same measured tone she used in every other case. She kept her voice steady, her posture controlled. But when the hearing ended and the courtroom emptied, she remained seated for a long moment. Alone in the silence, she let out the breath she had held since his name first reappeared. The courtroom was no longer just a place of justice. It had become the stage where past and present collided. The courthouse had weathered all kinds of storms, legal, political, even physical, but nothing quite compared to the quiet personal tempest that brewed behind Savannah's calm expression the week Douglas Miller's trial officially began. She sat at the bench, robes pressed, demeanor poised, while just a few feet away stood the man who had once dismissed her existence with a single brutal sentence. Every morning of the trial felt like a test of her own boundaries. Her alarm went off at 5 o'clock. She rose before the sun, packed Noah's lunch, reviewed trial notes, and stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, ensuring that no part of her expression betrayed the turmoil that waited just beneath the surface. Her son remained blissfully unaware, his mornings filled with cereal and soccer cleats, school bus chatter and spelling quizzes. He didn't know that the man on trial was connected to him by blood, a connection Savannah had fought to render irrelevant. Douglas sat quietly at the defense table. On the first full day of proceedings, he avoided eye contact. His lawyer did most of the speaking, outlining a defense built on procedural errors and claims of miscommunication with former clients. The charges were detailed: multiple counts of fraud, deliberate misrepresentation, manipulation of financial records, and unethical conduct over the span of 4 years. The evidence was strong, the paper trail damning. Savannah watched without blinking. She took notes with her usual precision, asked clarifying questions only when necessary, and maintained an emotional distance that left no room for doubt about her ability to remain impartial. Yet within her, a war raged quietly, one between memory and duty, between the daughter who had once stood in that very building as a pleading teenager, and the judge now tasked with delivering justice for crimes entirely unrelated to her own past. During recess, she stayed in chambers longer than usual, reviewing files with more intensity than required. Her clerk noticed the shift, but said nothing. Ms. Talbot had grown to understand Savannah's moods without explanation. The trial continued for 3 days, and each day brought new voices, victims who had trusted Douglas with their finances, their futures. Small business owners, elderly clients, even a local church had been affected. They described broken promises, lost savings, and the slow unraveling of trust. Savannah listened to each of them, not just as a judge, but as someone who understood betrayal. She didn't dwell on the irony that the man who had refused to accept her had later built, and destroyed, a business on trust. She didn't comment on the symmetry that had brought him before her not as a father, but as a defendant. Her responsibility remained clear. Douglas didn't testify in his own defense. His lawyer argued that there was no benefit, that the facts of the case could be better challenged without emotional entanglement. But even without taking the stand, Douglas watched Savannah in every session. When the court recessed, his eyes followed her. He never spoke. He never asked to address the court directly. He simply watched. On the final day of testimony, as the last witness stepped down, Savannah dismissed the court for a brief recess before closing arguments. As she returned to chambers, she caught a glimpse of Douglas rising slowly from his seat. Their eyes met, only for a second. But in that second, something passed between them. Not recognition, that had happened already. Not remorse, that had yet to come. It was a pause in time, like two people staring at a door neither was ready to open. Inside her office, Savannah closed the door and stood in silence. She allowed herself no tears, no outburst. She only stood at the window, watching as a single leaf drifted from the courthouse tree to the ground. The season had begun to shift. When court resumed, the closing arguments were swift. The prosecution emphasized the pattern of deception, the consistency of testimonies, the magnitude of harm. The defense leaned on intent, claiming that poor bookkeeping, not fraud, had created the situation. Savannah listened, hands folded on the bench, expression unreadable. She recessed the court for deliberation. Though the jury would ultimately deliver the verdict, she still held authority over the process, its fairness, its procedure. That evening, she stayed late in chambers. Ms. Talbot offered to remain, but Savannah insisted she go. She needed time to think, but not about the evidence, about what came next. When she returned home, Noah was curled on the couch, reading a graphic novel. He looked up and smiled. "You're home early." "It's not early, sweetheart," she said, setting her bag down and kneeling beside him. "You just lose track of time when you're inside a good story." He nodded, completely content. "Did you help someone today?" She looked at him, the child whose life had reshaped her own, and answered truthfully, "I think I did." That night, she sat at her desk with a blank notepad in front of her. She didn't write anything. She only sat in the silence, letting her thoughts unravel. There was no victory in this moment, no satisfaction. Just the slow recognition that she had walked through a fire without letting it consume her. The verdict would come the following day. And with it, the opportunity to speak not as a daughter confronting abandonment, but as a judge fulfilling her oath. Savannah didn't know if Douglas would ever apologize or even acknowledge the past. But it didn't matter. This trial wasn't about him finding redemption, it was about her finding closure. And that, at last, was within reach. The courthouse stood quiet under a grey sky the morning the jury returned with their verdict. Savannah arrived early, as always, her heels echoing across the polished floor of the side entrance. She moved with deliberate calm, every gesture measured. No one watching her would have guessed the storm that churned just beneath the surface. The finality of the moment had come. In a few hours, she would preside over the conclusion of a case that had begun long before any documents were filed, one that had started in the unspoken corners of her childhood. Her chambers felt colder that day. Ms. Talbot handed her the finalized notes for the session without comment, her eyes flickering with a quiet understanding they did not speak aloud. The name printed on the front page, Douglas R. Miller, seemed more clinical now, more distant. But Savannah's grip tightened slightly as she placed it on her desk. She took a breath, slow and deep. No distractions. No indulgence in memory. Just the law. When she stepped into the courtroom, the usual hum of anticipation filled the air. Members of the press had begun showing subtle interest, not because of Douglas, but because of Savannah. A young judge, poised and relentless, presiding over a high-stakes financial case. What they didn't know was that the drama they sought paled in comparison to the quiet, personal history unfolding just beneath the surface. Douglas sat at the defense table, his suit pressed but hanging loose on his frame. He looked older than he had even a week ago, tired, worn down by the weight of everything unraveling. His eyes darted up briefly when Savannah entered, but she offered no acknowledgement. Her focus was on procedure, order, and outcome. Personal history had no seat in her courtroom. The jury filed in. Savannah watched them carefully, noting the firm set of their mouths, the way they avoided looking at the defendant. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with a steady gaze, stood when called. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Savannah asked, her voice steady. "We have, Your Honor." The charges were read one by one. On each count, the response was clear and final. Guilty. The words landed with weight, not in the room, but in Savannah's chest. She gave no outward reaction. The law had spoken. Her role now was to uphold it with clarity and respect. She thanked the jury, dismissed them, and called a short recess before sentencing would be determined. As the jurors exited, murmurs filled the gallery, whispers rising like smoke. Douglas remained seated. His hands rested on the table, fingers laced tightly together. He didn't turn to his attorney, didn't look around. His eyes found Savannah's once more, not with defiance or desperation, but something quieter, perhaps disbelief, perhaps regret. She returned to chambers for those few minutes of recess. The air in the room felt heavier than usual. She didn't sit. She paced, silent, letting the silence anchor her. A knock at the door brought her back. "Judge, we're ready," Miss Talbot said gently. Savannah returned to the courtroom, each step firm with resolve. She reviewed the sentencing guidelines, considered the statements made during the trial, weighed the scale of financial harm against the absence of prior convictions. Her ruling, when delivered, was direct and unembellished. Prison time, financial restitution, a clear record of accountability. She delivered the sentence without emotion, only clarity. When it was done, she looked up one last time. Douglas didn't speak. He nodded once, slowly, his mouth tightening in a way that suggested words unsaid. Then he was escorted out by officers, shackled but silent. Savannah remained seated after the courtroom emptied. The door shut with a soft click behind the last journalist. Only then did she allow her fingers to unclench from the bench. She stared down at the desk in front of her, the echo of the verdict still humming in her ears. But there was no satisfaction, no sense of triumph, just quiet. The past had arrived and passed without chaos. That, she realized, was its own kind of reckoning. That evening, back in the comfort of her apartment, Savannah prepared dinner while Noah sat at the table sketching with crayons. He looked up when she placed a bowl of pasta in front of him. "Busy day?" he asked, his voice curious but not intrusive. She smiled softly. "Yes, a very full one." "Did people listen to you?" "Yes, they did." "Did you help anyone?" "I hope so." He nodded, accepting the answer without further question. For him, justice was a concept tied to bedtime stories and playground rules. He didn't yet understand the layers it carried, the histories it uncovered, the silence it sometimes required. Later that night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Savannah sat alone on the couch, a mug of tea warming her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat in the quiet storm that had followed the verdict, letting it settle around her like mist. The father who had once turned his back on her had now sat before her with nowhere to hide. Not because she had sought vengeance, but because the path of truth had finally circled back to where it had all begun. She didn't know if Douglas would ever think of her as more than the daughter he had rejected. She didn't know if prison would change him, or if anything ever could. But she knew one thing without doubt. He could no longer erase her. She had stood her ground, upheld the law, and delivered a judgment not just of legality but of self-worth. Her past hadn't broken her. It had shaped her, and now it no longer held her. She looked around the quiet apartment, the shelves lined with books and family photos, the walls once bare now covered in memories built through perseverance and love. She was no longer just a survivor. She was the author of her own peace, and in that peace, she finally rested. The days after the verdict passed with a stillness Savannah hadn't anticipated. She returned to work with the same posture, the same clarity, but inside, something had shifted. The courthouse hallways echoed with their usual rhythm, clerks shuffling papers, attorneys debating strategy, phones ringing with urgency. But for Savannah, everything moved a fraction slower, as if her internal clock no longer matched the world around her. She had carried the trial with disciplined restraint. The presence of Douglas in her courtroom had demanded a strength she hadn't known she still possessed. Now, with him sentenced and removed from her orbit, there remained only a strange hollowness. Not grief, not relief, just the quiet absence of something that had loomed for too long. Her colleagues offered polite praise for how she'd handled the proceedings, unaware of the personal significance. Even Ms. Talbot, ever observant, didn't comment beyond her usual nod of approval. Savannah appreciated the silence more than any congratulations. She didn't want admiration. She wanted space. One morning, nearly a week later, she arrived at her chambers to find an envelope resting neatly at the edge of her desk. It had no return address, only her name written in careful cursive across the front. Her initial instinct was to dismiss it as a note from a colleague or a member of the public, but something about the handwriting stopped her. It was unfamiliar, but precise, like someone who hadn't written freely in a long time. She opened it. Inside was a folded letter on plain stationery, the paper slightly yellowed, The ink faded around the edges. It had been written by hand, dated 5 years earlier. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Douglas. She read the first lines with slow caution. He had written it not long after learning of her law school admission, though it had never been sent. He admitted he had followed her achievements from a distance, piecing together what he could from public announcements, community newsletters, and courthouse updates. He didn't say why he never reached out, only that each year made it harder. He wrote of regret, not in sweeping apologetic language, but in short, clumsy admissions. He said he thought silence would protect them both, that he had been wrong, that the pride he felt watching her rise was mixed with the shame of knowing he'd never earned a place beside her. "I heard you gave a speech at your law school graduation," the letter said. "I watched it online. You spoke about justice like it was a living thing. I don't know if I've ever understood it the way you do, but I saw you speak, and I couldn't look away." Savannah read the letter twice, then again. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She simply folded it and placed it back in the envelope, sliding it into the bottom drawer of her desk. Not to forget, but to keep. That night, she sat with Noah on the balcony of their apartment. The sky stretched wide above them, purple dusk settling into silence. He was older now, more aware of her moods, and though he didn't ask questions, he watched her with the quiet attentiveness that often came naturally to children who had been raised by single parents. "Was today a hard day?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No harder than most." "You seem quiet." She considered telling him. Not the whole story, not yet, but something. "I got a letter," she said softly, "from someone I used to know. Was it a good letter?" "I'm not sure," she said truthfully. But it meant something. He nodded, satisfied with that. Then he leaned his head against her arm and stared out at the skyline. Savannah didn't revisit the letter for several days. Her life resumed its rhythm. She heard new cases, signed off on motions, mediated disputes between attorneys who argued more with ego than logic. But a part of her mind returned to those lines again and again. She thought about how much had been unsaid for years, how silence had shaped her more than words ever had. She wasn't sure what she wanted from the letter or from him. Maybe nothing, maybe just acknowledgement. She began journaling again, something she hadn't done since law school. Late at night, after Noah had gone to bed, she would sit at the kitchen table and write not about Douglas but about herself, about how strange it felt to outgrow your own past, about what it meant to forgive someone without ever hearing them say sorry, about justice, not as a profession, but as a personal reckoning. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Judge Miller." The voice was male, formal. "Yes, speaking. This is Warden Ellis at Belford Correctional. I'm calling on behalf of an inmate, Douglas Miller. He's requested a meeting. I understand this may be complicated." Savannah said nothing for several seconds. The refrigerator hummed beside her. Noah's footsteps echoed faintly from the other room. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course," the warden replied. "There's no pressure, just let us know." She ended the call and stared at the phone in her hand. She didn't know if she would go. She didn't know if she wanted to see him again, hear his voice, or risk reopening the part of herself that had learned to live without answers. But what she did know, what she could no longer deny, was that something had shifted inside her the moment she read his letter. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the faint flickering sense that some stories, even when closed, still leave space at the margins for questions. And maybe, for the first time, she was ready to ask them. Savannah had once believed that time was the only tool needed to outgrow a wound. She now understood it wasn't time, but choice. Repeated, deliberate choices to stand, to speak, to remain silent, to forgive, or to walk away. And some choices were made not once, but again and again. Each morning, as she woke and faced a world that once tried to break her, she reaffirmed the life she had built, a life that did not require apologies to be whole. Still, the call from the warden lingered. For days, she carried the thought like a stone in her pocket. She did not respond. She did not visit. But she kept imagining what such a visit would look like. She saw herself seated in a sterile room, hands folded, listening as the man who had once called her a mistake attempted to rewrite history in his own words. She feared what it might stir: regret, anger, grief, Or worse, a flicker of understanding that would leave her questioning everything she had already resolved. One afternoon, after a long day in court, Savannah returned to her chambers and opened the drawer where she had stored the letter. She didn't read it this time. She only held it. The paper had softened at the creases from being unfolded and refolded. Its contents were unchanged, but her relationship to them was not. She placed the letter back into the envelope, slid it into her satchel, and left for the evening. That night, after Noah had gone to bed and the apartment was dark except for the pool of light at her writing desk, she opened her own notebook and began writing a letter. Not to Douglas, but to herself. She wrote of things she had never spoken aloud. How she had once hoped for his voice at every school recital, his shadow in every passing car. How she had hated him, not for his absence, but for how easily he had created a space no one else could fill. How she had vowed to become something greater, not to spite him, but to escape the version of herself his absence had nearly left behind. And how she had succeeded. Page after page, she poured out what remained. There were no rehearsed lines, no legal tones. Just the rawness of a woman who had survived without a map. When she finally stopped, it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Her hand ached, her heart did not. She closed the notebook, left the pages unsent, and felt something within her loosen, like a knot untying itself after years of tension. The next day brought a small, unexpected shift. Ms. Talbot entered her chambers, carrying a stack of case files, setting them down neatly before pausing. "You received something," she said, handing over a plain manila envelope. There was no address, no sender, just Savannah's name, typed on a standard label. She opened it carefully. Inside was a second letter, this one clearly more recent. It was from Douglas again. The tone was quieter, more restrained. He wrote about his time in prison, how the silence had become familiar, how routine had replaced hope. He did not ask for forgiveness. He didn't explain the past. He simply wrote about her, about watching her rise, about hearing her name whispered through courtrooms with respect, about how he sometimes replayed the day she walked into his office at 17, not realizing until later that it had been the last chance he'd ever have to matter in her life. And then came the line that caught her breath. "I kept trying to write you a letter that said the right thing, and I always failed, so I never sent it. But I read about a speech you gave last year. You said justice is about presence, not punishment. You were right, I was absent, I know what that cost. And I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted you to have this. Something real, something late." Enclosed with the letter was a newspaper clipping. It was from a local magazine that had interviewed Savannah a few months back, celebrating her community initiatives as a judge. She had forgotten about the article, but clearly he hadn't. She sat with the letter for a long time. Unlike the first, this one felt less like a performance and more like a release. She still didn't know what she wanted to do with it. Responding felt unnecessary. Visiting still felt uncertain. But she did not return the letter to her drawer. She placed it on her desk beside her case files where she could see it, not as a reminder of the past, but as proof of a turning point. Not his, but hers. Claire noticed the shift during one of their coffee breaks. They sat in their usual booth, Noah at a nearby table scribbling in a puzzle book. "You've been quiet lately," Claire said gently. "Different." Savannah nodded. "I got a letter from him." Claire didn't need to ask who. She only reached across the table, her hand resting on Savannah's. "Do you want to talk about it?" "I'm still figuring it out." "That's allowed." Savannah smiled faintly. "It didn't change anything, but it helped me understand something." "What?" "That his absence didn't define me, but facing it finally helped me see just how far I've come without him." Claire squeezed her hand. "You were always more than what he left behind." That evening, Savannah walked home with Noah. The sun was setting behind the buildings, the sky streaked in pinks and golds. He skipped ahead, calling out street names, pointing at pigeons, carefree as ever. "Hey, Mom." "Yes? Do you think people always get second chances?" She paused. The question struck her deeper than he knew. "I think some do," she said carefully, "but it's not about getting the chance. It's about what you do with it." He nodded, satisfied, and kept walking. Savannah didn't know what came next. Maybe she would visit one day. Maybe she would never speak to Douglas again. But either way, the letters had arrived. Words once withheld now rested in her hands. not to guide her, but to release her from the questions that had no answers. And sometimes that was enough. The courthouse was busier than usual, a stream of voices, hurried footsteps, and muffled conversations bouncing off marble walls. Savannah arrived early, her presence a pillar of calm in the morning storm. She passed through security, nodded at the familiar guards, and climbed the wide staircase to her chambers. Today's docket was full, but there was one matter that carried an unspoken gravity, one that no clerk had mentioned aloud, though everyone on her team knew it lingered at the bottom of the list. The final item of the day, sentencing confirmation for Douglas R. Miller. It was procedural, a formality required after jury verdict and standard judicial review. The sentence had already been determined. The court had ruled. But the final appearance marked the conclusion of the case, and by extension, of something far more personal. Savannah reviewed the file again that morning, not because she needed to, but because the act gave her time to prepare. Not for him, for herself. There had been no further letters since the last, no follow-up calls from the prison, no requests, no attempts to extend the conversation. Douglas had said what he needed to say, and perhaps even in his limited understanding, he knew anything more would be unwelcome. Savannah had not written back. She had not visited, but she had read the letter several times, and though it didn't undo anything, it had shifted the weight of her silence into something she could carry with less resistance. At 10 o'clock, court began. Savannah moved through cases with quiet authority: land disputes, minor thefts, mediation referrals. Attorneys presented, witnesses testified, and she ruled with clarity. Her focus remained absolute until the moment Ms. Talbot approached and whispered, "Last case of the day, Judge." Savannah nodded and signaled for the bailiff to proceed. Douglas was brought in, wearing the standard inmate jumpsuit. He was thinner than before, his posture slightly slumped. The man who once turned her away with cold certainty now stood diminished, not just by circumstance, but by time. He did not speak. Savannah addressed the room as she always did. She outlined the purpose of the hearing, summarized the findings of the trial, and confirmed the conditions of the sentence. 6 years in state prison, with eligibility for early parole, after 4 based on conduct and restitution payments. As she spoke, Douglas kept his eyes on the floor. His attorney sat beside him, silent, knowing there was nothing more to argue. When it was time to close the session, Savannah paused. For a moment, the courtroom hung in suspended breath, waiting for her final words. She didn't look at Douglas, she didn't speak to him directly, but she allowed herself one small departure from the script. This court recognizes that justice is not always about erasing the past. Sometimes it's about acknowledging it, without allowing it to control the future. The law has spoken. Let the record stand. The gavel fell once, sharp and final. Court adjourned. As the room emptied, Douglas raised his eyes briefly. Just once. Savannah saw the movement but didn't meet it. She stood, gathered her notes, and turned away from the bench with the same measured steps she used every day. This moment, though layered with history, was not special. It was not dramatic. It was part of the job, a job she had earned without shortcuts, without favors, and without the man now being led out in chains. She returned to her chambers and closed the door behind her. For the first time in weeks, the air felt still again. She did not sit right away. She stood at the window, watching the courtyard below fill with people leaving for lunch, carrying folders, conversations, and burdens invisible to those passing by. There was no triumph, no celebration, only quiet certainty. That evening, she picked up Noah from school. He ran toward her with a smile, backpack bouncing behind him. On the drive home, he chatted about science class, a substitute teacher, and how he'd almost won a spelling game. At home, they made grilled cheese together. He grated the cheese. She toasted the bread. They argued playfully over how crispy it should be. After dinner, Noah curled up with a book on the couch, and Savannah stepped onto the balcony with a cup of tea in hand. The city stretched before her, glowing in the soft light of early evening. She thought of how far she had come, not in distance but in direction. She had moved forward when it would have been easier to freeze. She had created a world where love was chosen, not inherited, and today she had closed a door that had once seemed impossible to approach. Her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "How are you?" Savannah replied simply. At peace. She didn't explain more. She didn't need to. Later that night, after Noah had gone to bed, she sat at her desk and opened her journal. She wrote about the hearing. Not about him, but about the moment. How it had been quiet, final, and yet freeing. She wrote about the stillness after, the absence of pain, the presence of strength. She ended the entry with a single line. I did not need his words to find my voice. She closed the journal and turned off the light. Outside, the city breathed in silence. Inside, she did the same. The park wasn't fancy, just a wide green stretch with aging benches, a few worn-out slides and trees that lined the perimeter like quiet witnesses. Savannah had come here often when Noah was younger. It was where he'd taken his first uncertain steps on a summer morning, where he'd fallen and scraped his knee while learning to ride a bike, where they'd shared melted popsicles on hot afternoons and built memories out of simple rituals. Life had changed since then. Time had added layers to their days, school routines, court schedules, growing pains, but the park remained untouched by all of it. Now, at 10 years old, Noah ran through the open space, chasing shadows and laughter with the same energy that once propelled him into her arms. Savannah sat on the bench near the swing set, watching him, her coat folded neatly beside her, a thermos of coffee resting between her palms. It had been a month since Douglas's sentencing was finalized. No new letters arrived, no more calls from the warden. The chapter had closed not with thunder but with a gentle, definitive quiet. Savannah had returned to her work, her community initiatives, and her routines without interruption. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. A weight she hadn't even known she carried had lifted. She no longer measured her life in reference to what had been taken. She measured it by what she had built. Noah approached breathless, cheeks flushed with wind and play. He dropped onto the bench beside her and leaned into her side. I'm getting faster, he said, panting. You are, she smiled, brushing his hair away from his eyes. He looked up at her, brow furrowed in that way he had when something important stirred inside him. Can I ask you something? Always. He hesitated. You told me once that families can look different, that some people are there from the beginning and some aren't. Right? Yes. Were you ever mad at someone for not being there? She paused. Not from fear of the question, but from the care it deserved. I was, for a long time. But then I realized being angry didn't give me back what I lost. It only made me carry something I didn't need. Did you forgive them? Eventually. Not because they asked, because I needed to let go. Noah nodded slowly. I think that's brave. Savannah placed her arm around his shoulders. I think you're brave for asking. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt full, not empty. Around them, children played, leaves rustled, life moved forward. Later that afternoon, they walked home together. The sidewalks were familiar, the buildings unchanged. But to Savannah, the world felt new. She saw things differently now, not just the textures of her city, but the texture of her journey. She remembered every stage, the trembling girl in a high school bathroom, the fierce student buried in books and baby bottles, the tireless intern, the woman who once stood in a courtroom staring into the face of abandonment and did not break. She hadn't just reclaimed her life, she had rebuilt it from the roots up. Back home, she and Noah made dinner together. Nothing complicated, just pasta and salad, but they danced in the kitchen like it was a celebration. Music played softly from the speaker, and Savannah found herself laughing at Noah's offbeat twirls and exaggerated singing. The space that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a home, complete and unburdened. After dinner, Noah went to his room to finish a drawing. Savannah stayed at the table, leafing through papers from work, updating schedules, signing a few late reports. One of them was a letter from a young law student requesting to shadow her for a semester. She read the words with quiet pride, how the student had heard about her through a mentoring program, how they admired her career, how they hoped to one day follow a path like yours. She set the letter aside and wrote a brief response. A yes, with a meeting time attached. Mentorship mattered. She had made it through because people had believed in her. Mrs. Rowan, Claire, Professor Carmichael, Judge Brandt. It was her turn to hold the door open for someone else. Before bed, Savannah stepped onto the balcony once more. The city glowed below, its lights blinking like quiet stars. She took a breath of cool air and felt no weight on her chest. For the first time in years, there were no echoes following her into the night. Inside, Noah had already fallen asleep, his drawing on the nightstand, a simple scene of two figures holding hands beneath a tree, smiling. She kissed his forehead, turned out the light, and stood there for a moment longer. She thought back to the letter she had written but never sent. The one addressed to herself, the one that had helped her name everything she once buried. That letter still lived in her journal, folded and unread by anyone else. It would stay there, not as a confession, but as a marker, a line between who she was and who she became. She didn't need anything more. No apology, no explanation, no permission to keep moving forward. She had lived through rejection and absence, through doubt and isolation. She had become the person her younger self once needed, and in doing so, she had ensured that Noah would never grow up wondering if he was enough. Savannah turned off the lights, walked through her quiet home, and felt the peace settle over her like a blanket, not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer ruled her. Her life, reclaimed and rebuilt, was hers now, and that was more than enough.